Faith Family, United Church of Christ, Wednesday night spiritual growth study. I am Pastor Ed, and we are talking about homosexuality in the Bible. Is it fact or fabrication of hate? This is week 5 of our study, and today we'll be talking about Romans chapter 1. Before we get started, as I always like to remind people, there are things to do, the things we have to keep in mind when we come to a passage of Scripture. 3 things that I like to look at always before you get to looking at the passage and understanding the passage. The first thing is the culture. What is the culture in which it is written? Not only what are the things that they say, what are the things that they do, and just how their culture is different from our culture. The other one is the context in which it is written. We have to look at the verses around our passage and find out, is there more to it? Is this something that's contradictory, or is this something that is direct statement? And we'll see that a little bit in what we're going to do today, because what we do today, Paul is using rhetoric, Roman rhetoric, to steer us to another conclusion. And so by doing that, he always what you do is you go this and this and this, and you get 3 yeses, and then this, which is the next step. So it kind of guides you through the thought process, through a logical term, to get you persuaded to the actual understanding that he wants us to come to. So that's also in the context. And then, of course, the audience, and of course, our audience is the church in Rome. And these are the 7 texts that people use to condemn homosexuality, as we've seen going through the Old Testament, and now we're going into the New Testament. The Old Testament is more about rape and about welcoming than it is about homosexuality. Once again, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but homosexuality, sexuality in itself, back in the time of the Old Testament, and especially in the Roman times that we're going to talk about, it had more to do with power and being dominant over someone else. So it's kind of like having power, or being persuasive, or having a position in society, a high position in society, came with its privileges. So we'll see that today. But so far we've not come across a text in the Bible that straight out condemns homosexuality. So let's go into Romans chapter 1, and the verses that we're going to look at is 26 and 27. However, to get the full context, we need to go from verses 18 through chapter 2, verse 5. And this what I have here is right before 26. Okay, so for the wrath, or something I like to use, for the anger of God, is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness, for those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things God has created. So they are without excuse. For though they know God, they did not honor God as God or give thanks to God, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of God of immortal God for images resembling mortals, human beings, and birds, and four-footed animals or reptiles. That goes right up to verse 25. And now 26 is the verse that talks about what they say unnatural and natural relationships. And that they deem as homosexuality. But here you can see what we're talking about is not homosexuality. What Paul is talking about from the beginning in this context is idolatry. So keep that in mind. Let's look at the culture first of all. Of course, the book of Romans is written to a church in Rome. Paul has never been there, but he's sending a letter to them saying that he wants to come there, and he's giving them some baseline doctrine or baseline theology of the gospel and what he preaches. So he's in the end, he says he can't wait to be there and meet with them in person. So this letter is sometimes called a general epistle, or that is a general theological understanding. In other words, this isn't subject to a church that's having a particular problem. This is just, hey, this is generally how we're talking, or generally what we're teaching theologically. It was intended both to the Jews, the Jewish Christians that were there, and the Gentile Christians. And so as you read through the book of Acts and some of Paul's writings, you'll see that there's some little bit of tension between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians, because a lot of the Jewish people wanted to stick to the law. And so when Paul addresses both the Jewish and the Gentile Christians, he brings up the law and then reminds them that it's about faith. But here in our scripture that we're talking about, our passage that we're talking about today, we're talking about a general understanding, and that understanding at our point is that people don't know how to worship God correctly, and they're falling into idolatrous worship habits. So the Jewish culture on sex, okay, we've talked about this a little bit before. The Jewish understanding of sex, it's all about procreation. So if it's not for procreation, it's not of God. It's built into their law, as a matter of fact. They're told to go and multiply. It's important for their existence as the nation of Israel. They needed to procreate. They needed to gather up as many people as they could, because they were in a land that was not their home at first. And so the idea was to make as many offsprings as we could, as fast as we can, and as many as we could. And one note is the brother, okay? The idea of the brother, if your brother was to pass away and not have children with his wife, then one of his other brothers, or the only brother, would step in and produce an offspring with his brother's wife, so that she could have, or he would have, an offspring, because it was considered his brother's offspring and not the one that actually produced the child. So that's built into their law and their understanding. So in the Jewish culture, sex is all about procreation. Okay. In Paul's mindset, with that in mind, Paul being a devout Jew before he became a Christian, Paul's mindset, the only reason you have sexual relations is a divinely constructed plan for males and females to reproduce. Okay? So in Paul's mind, the only reason you have sex is to reproduce, and that's it. There's no pleasure in it. There's no other purpose for Paul. Paul's vocabulary, if you look through all of his writings, there's nothing in it that says sex is pleasurable. It's mandated for offspring's procreation, and that's it. Also, Paul's mindset, he uses a list of vices that manifest God's anger, and that is idolatrous behavior. If you look at all the things that he lists there in 29 through 31, that list is all about things that come out of idolatrous behavior. Okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit here too. Okay, so the Roman culture. So you had two cultures. You had the Jewish culture and you had the Roman culture. Now the Roman culture was very hierarchical, with those in power having the free reign to act out sexually any way they wanted. Among those of the lower cultural class or societal standings. In other words, if you owned a slave, you could sexually harass them, abuse them, whatever, because it didn't matter. They were of a lower standard than you, both your male and your female slaves. And it was accepted in Roman culture. Homosexuality was something that was accepted. But yet, the sex itself wasn't about an intimate relationship, one or the other, where as much as it was one person using another person. In a lot of cases, that didn't involve the marriage and that kind of thing. But so the cultural norm for I won't say norm, culturally, it was acceptable for those in power to use those lower cultural or societal standing people as sexual objects. In Roman culture, natural intercourse meant that a more dominant person penetrated a subordinate person. So that was normal intercourse for the Roman. Remember that it's all about power and control, like I have always said, and pleasure was only for those that had the dominating power. In other words, if you weren't on a higher social standing, then you could be the victim all the time. Okay, so the book of Romans as a whole, because we're looking at context again. So the book of Romans as a whole is like we said, a general understanding of Paul's theology. So he's writing this letter to people that he hasn't seen before. He might know something about them, but he wants to make sure that they understand his theological understanding, his understanding of the gospel, his understanding that it's about faith and not about the law, and his understanding of who God is, who Jesus is, and what we can expect to be like as a Christian community. So he's writing this to them to prepare them for when he gets there. It's kind of like a letter of introduction or a letter of what to expect when he gets there. And here's a breakdown of the Romans as a whole. And you see God's anger at the Jewish and Gentile sinfulness, the fact that they're not worshiping God the way God is supposed to be worshipped. Justification by faith. Everybody knows that Romans is what Martin Luther based his whole idea about faith alone. God's salvation by faith, again, talking about the faith. And then God's promise to Israel. And this is where Paul points out to the Jews that although that they have rejected God, and God has went and found a bigger audience to be the world, as he promised through Abraham, that they too would be a part of that salvation. So basically, all are a part of salvation. And then we get into appropriate Christian living, how to live as a Christian community. And then one of the big things, of course, Paul, you could probably, if we were still writing the Old Testament, you would put him in the Old Testament prophets, because he talks a lot about the strong having compassion for the weak, and the strong having compassion for the weak. See, I wrote it down twice there because it was so important. And then finally, the blessings, and concludes with the doxology. So that's Romans in a nutshell. And we can see there that why do we take two verses out of that whole letter and make them so important when there's so much more important things there? And we take them out of context, of course, and cause them to be a proof text that homosexuality is a sin, but it's not there. Okay, so once again, context, Romans chapter 1 and 2, the overarching thesis for 1 and 2, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. The gospel, it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith. Salvation to everyone who has faith. To the Jew first, and then to the Greek. For it is the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. That is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. So, what do you think the whole book of Romans, or the epistle of Romans, the letter of Romans, is about? It's about living by faith and God's righteousness. So, before we get to our verses, in verses 16 and to 27, we learn that it is because they know God and they did not honor him as God or give him thanks, but they became futile. And I read this a little bit earlier. In other words, it's about idolatry. He's talking about idolatry. And then he says in verses 26 and 27, he says he gave them over. God gave them over. And what it means when they gave them over, and it follows in the list of other things that God has given them over to. So in other words, it's the idolatry that God has given them over to do these other things. Okay? So, and then the worship of idol causes, 29 through 39, the list there. Slanders, gossips, having evil thoughts. And it's not homosexuality that causes these things, but it's the idolatry. Paul, they say, Paul is replying or replying with the wisdom of Solomon in chapter 14:20. That's in the Old Testament, where all sin or evil comes from idolatry. As a matter of fact, that's what it says in the new NIV, or the New Revised Standard Version. The Wisdom of Solomon 14:27 says, "For the worship of idols not to be named is the beginning and the cause of and end of all evil," or of every evil. So think about that. Where Paul is coming from, anything that does not give honor to God is idolatrous, and therefore is the beginning of all evil. Now we know that a lot of the sexual practices in the Roman period were done so in temples and in worship to other gods. But we also know that what we see about the culture is that these were done not as a way of mutually sharing a relationship between two people, but to establishing dominance. And how is establishing dominance in correlation with God's plan, God's way of organizing the world? It's not. So we can see that it's the idolatry that causes these things. The idea that man or human wants to be more dominant, wants to be more powerful, and the only powerful, true power is the power of God. So I'll stop preaching. Okay. There's two words that we want to look at in our chapter, chapter 1 and chapter 2. The first one is paradidomai, excuse me. This is to give up or deliver, give them over, as it says in our passages. When this is used in the Old Testament, it's always referring to God's action. In other words, God is giving something over. In other words, God is doing the acting upon someone else. So it's always divine in nature. And in the New Testament, this phrase is used, or this word is used 8 times, 5 of which come from the gospel, and it's about Jesus at the time of his crucifixion. And you can see Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then another one in John, which is when Jesus says, the last one in John 19, excuse me, is when Jesus says, it is finished, and he gives himself over to the divine plan. So this suggests this idea to give over, what it says, God gave them over to their ... whatever they were, is God's divine plan. In other words, maybe God is allowing them to do these things until they realize how bad it is that they're doing them, and they'll wake up and turn to the true God. So the other one is krisis. Krisis is translated in our verses here as intercourse, but the Greek English lexicon defines it as the sexual function or use of the same or opposite sex. Sexual function, sexual use. Do you catch a meaning here out of this? It's suggesting that one person is using another person in reference to sex, not a mutual relationship between two. Kind of sounds like rape, exploitation, what we call, a lot of times we call today human trafficking, sexual trafficking. So we can see that it's pointing to something more than just the act of sex between two mutually agreeable people and going to the point of being used or exploited. Okay. And then here we got at the beginning of chapter 2, what we see, Paul says that everyone has committed some kind of idolatry. He lists all these things, and he points out that it is because of them that God has turned everyone over to our own vices, so that they should have faith in God and allow God to judge appropriately and righteously. So what Paul is saying is God has allowed these things to happen because people are not worshiping God correctly. So he says, okay, worship those things, do those things that I know will cause you pain and suffering, and when you finally figure it out for yourself, then they'll come back to you. At least that's how I interpret God's plan. So it is through our examples then that Paul points out in the rest of Romans that the world will be overcome. These worldly power struggles, the idolatry, and all of that will be overcome through faith and love. And that's what Paul's theology is. And that's what Paul's saying to the Romans. So, in conclusion, interesting thing, in all of Romans, there is no mention of queer sexual mutual relationships in this letter. So what is Paul's point here? Paul's point is it's about idolatry. Not only is it about those who conduct this idolatry in some form of worship, but he also says those of you that don't perform this perform some other type of idolatry. So we're all guilty. And then Paul says that God gave these idolatrous, these idol worshipers over to acting in a manner that would be inappropriate to be a Christian, or inappropriate for Christians. Acting not only sexually, rape, but with wickedness, envy, murder, strife, all of these other things. Just because you're not doing it sexually, the fact that you're doing it out of a desire for power, a desire to be more like God. And what was Satan's sin? He wanted to be like God. So all this other stuff flows out of this idea that we want to be God, and we want to either worship ourselves and not worship the Creator God. And so that's what this scripture is about. This scripture is not about homosexuality. It's about idolatry. Okay, if you have any questions, please email them to me. I'd be more than happy to answer all questions. Next week we're going to look at 1 Corinthians and see what it says there. So next week, peace and love.